Good morning. Today we continue our study in the top 10 stories in Genesis, according to me. And we're looking at the story of Cain and Abel. The story of Cain and Abel occupies the 4th chapter of the Bible. Why is this story given such prominence? Why not later on in the Bible or not at all? It really seems to be just a simple story of fratricide or one brother rising up and murdering the other. But there's a lot more going on than that in this story. So let's grab some coffee and dig into this text. You're watching the Caffeinated Bible, and my name is David Paris, and the goal of this channel is to help you read and interpret your Bible in a much more informed and engaged manner. So if you like this material, please subscribe, and it really helps the channel out a lot if you give it a big thumbs up as well. Now, as we dive into this chapter, we need to realize that this chapter is linked by themes, words, and ideas to what we've already looked at in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, but especially chapters 2 and 3. In chapter 4, the author gives us a brief glimpse of life outside of Eden. The woman bears sons, and these sons are then both going to become workers of the ground and tenders of sheep. Thus, the narrative assumes that the effects of the fall recorded in chapter 3 are being lived out in their daily life now. At the very start, let me say I'm going to take a narrative approach to this chapter, and in particular construct a narrative plot diagram about this story. If this is something new to you, then take a look at my video on narratives and how to construct a narrative plot diagram there. I'll have a link up here in the video and also in the Show More section underneath this video, so you can go back and take a look at that. So if you have questions about how to interpret a narrative or drawing a narrative plot diagram, go take a look at those videos first. Now let's draw out a basic narrative plot diagram, and then we're going to start filling in the details as we go. Now, a narrative plot diagram starts off with a very quick introduction, and then the story quickly ramps up or escalates in tension. Now, this is done very, very quickly, maybe just a verse or two, and then across the top here, we have this plateau where the biblical authors like to hold us at the highest level of conflict or need. Then finally, we have another turning point where we get the resolution for the story and a very quick conclusion or summary statement at the very end that will lead us into the next story. So let's start putting information on this diagram. Genesis 4:1. Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. Then she said, I have brought forth a man with the Lord. Now this chapter opens with a huge gap. The man and the woman have been exiled from the garden, and then now they find themselves in the world. But it seems like they've been plopped out in the middle of the early Bronze Age. There's domesticated livestock, they have arable crops, and also because we're going to see cities being built later on, they probably understand basic construction techniques as well. You have metallurgy and then also the introduction of music later on in this chapter. Now there's no explanation at all given in this chapter where all this comes from or how the other people appear in this story. All sorts of explanations have been offered through the history of the interpretation of the Bible. The key thing to note here is that the author of Genesis is not interested in answering or addressing those questions at all. All these social developments and other people are just assumed in the story. Instead, the author focuses on 4 people, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and at the very end, Seth. Let's go back to the text here. In verse 1, Eve says, I have brought forth, or made a man with, and then in parentheses, help of the Lord. Now, the whole idea of help is something that we stick in the English translation to try and smooth off the Hebrew here. The translation really comes across with this idea that she has either brought forth, or she has acquired, or she has made a man, and then either with, or like, or as the Lord. And there's 2 ways we can read this. If we take it in a positive sense, then her words reflect back on the promise in 3:15 that God would give her a seed that would crush the head of the serpent. Or it could be translated as a boast. Just as God created Eve in chapter 2, Eve has now created a man. In this sense, it sets up the theme in Genesis where God makes a promise, but then people try to achieve it through their own means. Her words also stand in contrast to the conclusion of the chapter. Here she says, I have created or made a man just as the Lord did. At the very end of the chapter, she's going to say, God has given me another child, this seed that was promised to her in chapter 3. So this verse not only introduces our story, but immediately sets up the conflict that is going to need to be resolved within this story. And it's at this point that the escalating line of tension or conflict begins to take place. Verse 2. Then she gave birth to his brother Abel. Abel took care of the flocks, while Cain cultivated the ground. Now names are important here. Cain's name is a play on words in the Hebrew verb create, kana, and his name, Cain. So when Eve says that she has kana, she has made a man, and she names him Cain, you've got this rhyme or this play on words that's taking place there. Abel's name, by contrast, sets out a very ominous tone in this story. The noun Abel occurs 73 times in the Old Testament, and usually it means vapor, mist, vanity, emptiness, or nothingness. So when she names the younger brother Abel, it's like, that's a bummer, dude. And we immediately know that this brother is transient, he's empty, he's like a vapor. He's here today, but gone tomorrow. Cain is the older brother, and Abel is the vulnerable brother, both in age and in terms of his name. Our story continues in verse 3. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruit of the ground for an offering to the Lord. But Abel brought some of the firstborn of his flock, the fat of them. And the Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering. But on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Now we see the intensification of this story as it goes along in these verses. We have two sacrifices, Cain and Abel's. And one of the biggest challenges interpretively within this chapter concerns the question why Abel's sacrifice was acceptable but Cain's was not. The text does not provide us with an answer, yet at the same time the way it's mentioned is done in a way to provoke our thought. Wait a minute, what's going on here? This seems totally capricious. The author wants to engage you in the story, to make you scratch your head and ask questions and pay attention. Now, both of these offerings are acceptable according to the Mosaic Law. We are also told something about Abel's offering here. It's from the firstborn and from the fat of them. This text is implying that Abel has done well in his offering. But it doesn't say that Cain did poorly or not. It's very subtle here and hints at that. And I think that's part of the beauty of this story. It hints at things, but it doesn't just come out and say them. Cain was more privileged than his brother, and as the older son, he would have received the blessing from the family and also the inheritance. Yet God does not look on him or his offering with favor. By doing this, our expectations are immediately reversed, and most likely Cain's as well. What the heck is going on here? I should be the older son. I should be the favored one. Why is God looking at this vanity, this vapor, and his offering and not mine? We also learn two things about Cain here in verse 5. A, he was angry, and then B, it says that he looked down, or his countenance fell. Now, when we're presented with a problem or something that we've done wrong, we have two options. We can either keep plowing along in the same direction, or we can figure out what went wrong. Cain doesn't do that. He's going to keep plowing along. He's angry and he is looking down. The sibling rivalry between Cain and Abel that is set up here is something that runs through the Bible. Ishmael is going to bully Isaac, and Abraham is going to have to send him and his mother away. Jacob is going to steal his older brother Esau's blessing and must flee from him. Even down to the story of the two sons in the parable of the prodigal son, we see this rivalry between the older and the younger son taking place. This verse is also the turning point in the story. in the ascending line of conflict. Notice how the story is going to dramatically shift after this point. 4:6. Then the Lord God said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? Is it not true, if you do what is right, you will be lifted up? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door, and it desires to dominate you, but you must subdue it." In my videos on narratives, I mention how in the biblical text, what a person says is often the most important part of the story. And if we look at this story here, 11 of the first 16 verses are dialogue. So dialogue is central to understanding this story of Cain and Abel. Why are you angry? It's odd that God has to ask this question, as if he didn't know the reason. The fact that God favored one sacrifice and not the other is not dealt with at all. It's just left as some sort of capricious decision on God's part. In the dialogue, God is going to ask Cain 3 rhetorical questions and then give him an admonition. Why is he angry? Why is your face turned down? And then a proverbial type question, if you do right, will not your face be lifted up? And you see this whole idea where God asks him, why is your face turned down? Why are you just stewing with rage? If you correct your attitude and your actions and you amend your behavior, won't your face be lifted up? And while we can read this as a straightforward piece of sort of common advice, it also hints at the core of the problem. Cain's face is metaphorically and literally turned down. His face is not up, facing and looking at others. Sin is crouching at your door. This is a warning. Sin is metaphorically pictured like a beast crouching in the brush, waiting to attack. It's sort of like Cain has been bifurcated. We have his sin and we have him, and which part is going to conquer the other? If he doesn't change his path, it's going to lead to dire consequences for him. Verse 8, Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let us go out to the field." And while they were in the field, Cain rose up on his brother Abel and killed him. At the start of this video, I asked the question what this story was all about. Usually when I ask that question in a classroom type setting, the answer is Cain murdering Abel. But notice how little attention is given within the text itself to this. Basically, we only have a half sentence in English. So what is this story all about? Now, the first thing I want you to notice here is that "let us go out to the field" is not in the best manuscripts. And if we leave it out, we can understand why some copyists filled it in later. In other words, we have a statement from Cain. He speaks to his brother, but we have no content. So they provide the content to make the story easier to read. If we leave it out, 2 interesting things come out of this sentence here. First off, this is the only clause in the story where somebody says something, but we don't get the content for it. It's really empty speech. It can also be read as speaking against his brother. In other words, instead of speaking to his brother, he's speaking against. He's muttering complaints and grumbling against him. And Cain is allowing this resentment to brew inside him until he indulges in that hostility. When Cain is in the field with his brother Abel, he rises up like a wild beast and kills his transient, vapor, empty brother Abel. One thing is clear. Cain has not listened to God's advice, and as such he becomes a prime example for the people of Israel who must listen to the voice of the Lord God. Verse 9, Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" And he replied, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" We're now on the top plateau where the author is going to hold us to the highest level of conflict or need that needs to be resolved. This is where most biblical stories focus, and in most cases, it's where the most important aspect or the lesson of the story is revealed. As in chapter 3, verses 9 through 13, where you get these questions of, where are you? Who told you were naked? Did you eat from the tree? We have questions here as well. In both of the stories, the Lord asks questions to draw the person out, to give them a chance to respond to God. Cain's reply has 2 ideas. The first off is, it's a lie. I don't know. He knows exactly where his brother is. He killed him. And then he asks this question, am I my brother's keeper? Now this is a really rude question, and it's putting God off. As such, it shows his anger and his broken relationship to his creator and to his family. But it also goes back to Genesis chapter 2. In Genesis 2:15, Adam is commanded by God to work and keep the garden. Now he asks the question with the same verb, am I to keep my brother? Even though the text does not provide a clear answer, you respond to it automatically in your mind. Yes, you are your younger brother's keeper. Verse 10, the Lord said, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth. There's a strong connection here between God, Cain, his brother, and the earth. This verse, while a metaphor, is also horrific in its image. The earth is opening its mouth and it has swallowed Abel's blood, and now it's crying out to God against Cain. And because of his crime against his brother, his relationship with the earth that he works is broken. Cain worked the ground, but now the earth speaks out in judgment against him. In verse 12, we have an echo back to Adam's judgment. His work on earth will be in vain by the sweat of his brow. With Cain, it's going to be worse. It will no longer yield its crops for him. He will be cut off from what he was, a farmer. And on top of that, he's going to wander on the face of the earth. Before he put down roots, now he has no roots. Verse 13, then Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is too great to endure. Look, you are driving me off the land today, and I must hide from your presence. I will be a homeless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. God does not kill Cain for murdering his brother. Instead, he says, you're going to have to live with what you have done. And once again, we are hit with an area where the text has some play in it, and it asks questions about how we understand it. Does Cain really complain that his punishment is too great for him to bear, or should we understand this as a reply that his sin was too great to forgive? Now, the Hebrew word here can refer to either the sin or the punishment, and in this way the sentence is sort of constructed in a way that leaves this double meaning open for us to consider. Contextually, given that Cain is grieving about being driven from the ground, I think that God's punishment is greater than he can bear is perhaps the stronger reading. Like his parents Adam and Eve, who were driven from their home, the garden, the penalty against Cain is banishment from a protective community, his family, and the land that he worked. But the Lord said to him, not so. If anyone kills Cain, Cain will be avenged 7 times as much. Then the Lord put a special mark on Cain so that no one who found him would strike him down. So Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. What is the mark on Cain? And the text is silent on this or what the mark was. We only know that he was given some sort of protective mark or sign, not what it was. The one thing we can say is that God deals with him with mercy, even in punishment. When Cain goes out from the Lord's presence, it echoes back to Adam and Eve being cast out of the Garden of Eden. But Cain moves it one step further from God's presence. He has a broken relationship with his brother, with the land, with God, and his parents. He is now a wanderer on the face of the earth with no home, family, or God. And in a final play on words, we miss the author's point in English, but the name for the land of Nod in Hebrew means wander. So he's a wanderer in the land of wandering. One of the features of biblical narratives is what we would call the inclusion of narratives within another story, or a sandwich story. You have one story inside another. This is a great example of that. In verses 17 through 24, we are given a brief summary of Cain's lineage. And then in verse 25, we're going to return back to our main story. Now, these sandwich stories are often used to provide background information or a tangent off the main line of our story. Notice how you could take this story, verses 17 through 24, about Cain's lineage. You could take it right out of our story, and our main story would flow from verse 16 into verse 25. It would make perfect sense. This sandwich story also forms the turning point of our story, from the plateau of the highest level of conflict to its resolution. Adam lay with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, saying, "God has given me another child in the place of Abel, since Cain killed him." Seth also had a son and named him Enosh. At that time, men began to call on the name of the Lord. In the resolution phase of our story, we return to the two characters at the opening of our story, Adam and Eve. Before we move on, I want to bring attention to just how tragic this story is. Adam and Eve have lost paradise. They've lost their relationship with God. Then they've had two children, and the older kills the younger. Then that older one is forced to flee away. So they have lost everything: home, family, relationship with God. This is an incredibly tragic story. And I think one of the most poignant expressions of just the tragic nature of this story is in the song Lullaby to Cain. But it really expresses, I think, Eve's heartbrokenness and sorrow and loss, and also the implications of this story for Cain as well. It's a beautiful song and it's well worth listening to, so the links to it will be down below, or I'll have a link up here also. At the very end of the story, we're returning back to where we began. Adam and Eve, and a new son is being born. The birth of Seth also introduces another theme that runs through Genesis, most of the Bible, and throughout the ancient Near Eastern culture. The oldest son was extremely important. They carried on the family lineage and name. But in Genesis, the oldest son doesn't inherit the blessings in many cases. Oftentimes, the younger son subverts that and inherits them. Also, notice how God provides the seed through the younger sons. So it's not going to be through Ishmael, but through Isaac. It's not going to be through Esau, but Jacob. The one through whom God's promises come will not be the heir apparent, the oldest son, but the one whom God selects. The naming of the child here, Seth, is also important. Eve calls him Seth because she said, "God has granted or given me another child." So she calls him Seth, which is related to sheath, the verb there, granted or given. To underscore the importance of the line of Seth and his descendants, the author also noticed that in his days, people began to call on the name of the Lord. So what's the big picture to this whole story? When we look at the plot line, we can see that this story is not about Cain murdering Abel. Rather, that is just a small detail. It is something that occurs in the story. The emphasis and the bulk of this story focuses on how God deals with Cain. Am I my brother's keeper? To which we would respond with an affirmative yes. This means that we have to care for one another, especially in light of Abel's name of being vapor or worthless or empty. He is very vulnerable and needs special care. We cannot separate our care from our brother, from the land, and from our relationship with God, and vice versa. These three are all interlinked within this story. Throughout this horrific story, we see God engaging the perpetrator in dialogue. As I mentioned before, 11 of the first 16 verses are dialogue between Cain and God. Before the crime, God counsels him to change his ways. Immediately afterward, God questions him about what he has done, much like he did with Adam and Eve in the garden, to elicit a confession and contrition. And finally, in punishment, he shows him mercy by offering him protection. Eve plays a very important role in this story as well. She starts out poorly at the beginning, I have made a man just like God. And at the very end of the story, after all of her loss, she has this great statement where she says, God has given me another child. This story is not so much about the murder of Abel. That happens. Rather, it is all about God and how God deals with us. I hope you found this narrative study on Genesis chapter 4, God's dealing with Cain, very provocative and thought-provoking. If you enjoy these videos, please subscribe, give it a big thumbs up. That helps YouTube know that this should be a video that they promote and recommend to other people. Until next week, when we continue our study of the top 10 stories in Genesis, peace.